churches in the Detroit area to attack, and this church had banned anybody from having permitted concealed handguns on church property.
Hmm.
And he explained to his compatriot that that made it easier for him to kill lots of people before anybody could arrive.
So this man has actually written the book, The War on Guns, so you can imagine why we would want to have him on right now. You can follow him on the Twitter at John R. Lott, L-O-T-T Jr. Mr. John Lott, thank you for being here, sir.
Oh, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
We're super glad to have you on. So I know, listen, I mean, we've talked about guns quite a bit, and you and I were just talking off air about how it's a surprisingly winning issue with younger people. And often a lot of people on the right aren't aware of just how much of a winning issue it is. We've had to run-ins with Vox, and I know that you have. So let's start with this. Right now, obviously, this gun debate is being, I mean, so much of it is just, it's a quagmire. Let's start separating it piece by piece with you, sir, the expert. Vox wrote a recent article, America's Unique Gun Violence Problem, and you basically deconstructed it point by point. How about you take us through that and what that experience was like?
Well, they've had, I guess, a post with like 17 charts where they go and they claim that the United States is unique in terms of gun violence, that we're unique in terms of the rate that people own guns in the country. And obviously they draw a connection between the two, indicating that if we could only get rid of the guns, we'd end up reducing the level of violence in the United States. There's so many kind of different levels of problems with it. I mean, people don't even understand that there's a difference between murder and homicide.
Right.
They use data in ways that just is not kosher, that, academics wouldn't go and use, and I'm happy to talk about it. But, so for example, murder and homicide, most people don't know that the difference between the two is justifiable homicides. Homicides are murders plus cases where either police or civilians use guns to protect themselves. And so, in a typical year recently, you would have had maybe about 8,000 firearm murders, but you'd have maybe 12,000 firearm homicides. And they don't know how large of a share that the vast majority of those firearm murders are gang related.
Right. Do you think they don't know at this point? I mean, you're an academic, and some of them at Vox can be argued are academics. Do you think they don't know?
Kind of like Obama on the wage myth.
Yes, it's like President Obama on the wage gap. You're going,
you have Google too.
Google, or is he trying to push a message? Do you really think they don't know at this point, or they're so entrenched in the agenda that they have to continue with it? Because I know your research shows the opposite might be true, which I'd like to get into.
Right. Well, I mean, it's hard to get in people's heads to know what's actually motivating them on things. There are lots of prominent cases where numbers are put out where I just know they're fraudulent. So I suppose one of the more prominent examples, there's this guy named Adam Langford who has put together data, he says, on mass public shootings around the world, claiming that the United States makes up about a third of the mass shootings around the world, but only 4% of the world's population. I've been asking for the guy's data since it got attention in 2015. I mean, when it came out, he had the front page, top above the fold of every major newspaper in the country and most of the minor ones.
Yeah.
It got coverage in at least 30 different countries.
Got the mad fold in the back. You're like, 4%. No, you're absolutely. It's funny that you bring that up because we've done this quite a bit, and they don't send their sources. But I've not heard that one before. I know it's false right away because of the research we've done. When you look at mass shootings in places like the Honduras and South American countries, unless is he?
Well, see, here's the problem. So you look at mass public shootings of 4 or more people.
Right.
In the United States, you're going to get all the cases, but so he's looking at data from the 1960s through 2012. Does anybody really believe that you're going to be able to find all the mass public shootings in Africa or South America or Central America in the late 60s, in the 70s? I mean, it's not like
record keepers.
Yeah.
It's not like their newspapers were even online at the time.
Yeah.
And
half the archives were blown away by Coney in Africa. There's no way to get it. I can't imagine. And no one called him on his claim?
Well, the thing is, the media doesn't care about it. I just been going back and forth with some people at the New York Times because they just a few months ago ran a huge full page showing graphs that he had from his data. The thing is, the graphs are unusable to try to figure it out because they don't label the dots, and the vast majority of dots are kind of all scrambled together, so you can't figure out what the number he's claiming for individual countries. So I'd like to get information on the actual cases that he
Right.
has, or if that doesn't work, which they won't give you, at least tell me the number of cases he's claiming by country. But they won't do that,
Yeah.
and the reporters, they don't care. They don't ask. So the thing with the New York Times, Langford had told the New York Times, or told us, that he had given the New York Times exclusivity. Now you're dealing with the media. Even if
Exclusivity
you
with
give
data on gun violence? It's not a scoop.
right, no, but even if somehow you had giving them exclusivity, it would just be to let them run it first.
Right.
You're not going to go and say, well, I'm going to give the newspaper exclusivity for 5 months or for perpetuity after that.
Right.
And then when we contacted the New York Times, they said, well, you have to get it from Langford, that they weren't going to give it out to us. I don't know why, but it's just silly
That's
that
great. I have to protect my sources. What do you mean? Who? The
it's
CDC.
like,
It's the CDC, except it's not.
so anyway, it's just, there's so many things out there. And,
Well, let me ask you this: if you were to
I've
laser,
tried
what would you
talking
say is the most repeated false point in the gun control narrative right now? If you had to zone in on one, and we can go to number 2 and 3, but what would you say is most important for people to know?
I suppose maybe the simplest thing is just how do you make comparisons across places? So you'll see people say, well, look, the United Kingdom has very strict gun control, very few guns are owned, and they have a low homicide rate compared to the United States. And and they say, therefore, that means that it's the strict gun control that's causing the low crime rate there.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that if you look before they had the gun control laws, they had an even lower homicide rate.
Right.
That when they passed the different gun control laws, their homicide rate went up. It was still lower than the United States. But given that it was even lower before they had the gun control laws, it's hard to go and say they have a low homicide rate because of the gun control laws. There's
Right.
obviously other things that vary across countries and places that are accounting for the difference there.
Well, I feel as though they've moved even away from that. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but again, we deal in this world quite a bit with Vox and with HuffPo, and of course they point to the Australian mandatory buyback. They don't tell you it's a mandatory buyback, because no one wants to take your guns away, by the way, in case you were paranoid. But they've moved away, it seems, from for example, gun homicide. They've moved entirely just to gun-related homicide because the violent crime rates are actually worse in a lot of these countries with strict gun control. We see
the
facts
murder
a lot.
rate.
Yes.
Yeah, and so, a lot of countries don't report murder rates.
Right.
And also, one of the things is that there's a much bigger difference between homicides and murders in the United States than there is most other countries. We have that's there. But you mentioned the Australia stuff. The Australia stuff, I don't know, hoax or whatever. It's just complete misinformation. So I'll just give you a simple example. They'll go and they'll say that firearm homicides were lower after the 96, 97 buyback than they were before. And that's true. But the thing is, it was falling for 15 years prior to the buyback, and it was falling afterwards, but at a slower rate.
Right.
And so, if it were falling at a faster rate, or there was a kind of a big downward jump right at that time, it would make more sense. But if it's falling before, if you have a straight line and it's falling over the entire period, you could pick any year,
right,
and the after average would be below the before average. You wouldn't take that as evidence that any of those years were somehow crucial for changing the levels that were occurring there in terms of firearm homicides. The other thing is, that's never mentioned, it's true they had this big buyback. About a third of the guns were bought back in 96 and 97. But people were then able to go out and buy guns again. And by 2010, the gun ownership rate in Australia was actually above what it was prior to the buyback. So if they're right about this, what you should have seen is a big, sharp, immediate drop and then an increase
Right.
over time. And that's not what you observe.
Well, we've written about that quite a bit. And isn't it also true that you see the same trend in New Zealand, which would be the most comparable country as well during that same period of time, and they didn't have the mandatory buyback?
Yeah, well, you definitely exactly right. You don't see it in terms of the mass public shooting. I mean, you see the same trend in terms of mass public shootings.
Right.
Look, New Zealand actually had a bigger drop in the rate of mass public shootings at the same time than Australia did, and yet they didn't pass any laws that would be related to this.
Exactly. And that was during the time the Hobbit trilogy was released, so people were on
right,
edge.
that must be it. I think that was the key. So, you know,
It's
you
hard
have
to
lots
compare
of
across countries. A good example of that is infant mortality rates. You know, we've talked about this with healthcare quite a bit. When people try to bring up socialized healthcare, they say, well, these other countries spend less and it's better. Really, the only barometer that's used when they're talking about that is polling data by subjective measurements where they ask people, are you satisfied with your health care? And people say, yes. But if you look at wait times in emergency rooms, the United States is better. If you look at mortality rates from serious illnesses.
Objective empirical data.
Empirical data.
Some would say.
Yes, which isn't necessarily the realm sometimes of our political opposition when they're dealing with these topics. Have you found it hard to find someone who's willing to step up, like you said, with these sources, but to have a conversation or debate? Because I know the New York Times just ran today a piece saying how to have the gun control argument today. And I don't know if you saw this in the opinion page. And I was going, well, hold on a second. You didn't just have an argument. You just wrote an op-ed. You still have yet to have an argument.
Yeah, look, I'll tell you, the gun control people have an agreement among themselves not to debate me. And I think there are a couple reasons for that. One is for TV shows, they'll usually want to have people from both sides. And if everybody from the different gun control groups don't want to debate me, I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I'll get a call from CNN or somebody, be driving into the studio, and I'm like 5 minutes away from the studio, and I'll get a call from the producer saying, well, we're going to have to go a different direction. None of the Bloomberg people, when we told them that you were going to be on the air, said that we had to get somebody else.
They said they'd rather book a gay guy who was a former Republican and supports sensible gun control measures. That's a better conversation. We're going to go with that one. Let me ask you this: since we can't compare across different countries, and I've talked about that.
We can look at things across countries, but you have to do it in a particular way. So, for example, I'll give you a simple question. That is, can you name me one place in the world that's banned guns, either all guns or all handguns, and seen murder rates fall or even stay the same? Every single place that's banned guns has seen increases, often very large increases in murder rates. And
they would say Japan. What about Japan? That's the example they often use. And I know the answer, but I figured I'd toss it out there.
Right. Well, the thing is with Japan, you want to look before and after they have the gun control laws.
Right.
Japan's had a low murder rate as long as we have numbers from them. And they've had very strict gun control laws since the 1700s. Only samurai were basically legally able to go and own guns. So, you want to have something where we can say, like when the UK banned handguns in January 97, their homicide rate went up 50% over the next 8 years. You see similar increases. So you look at island nations, because gun control advocates will say, okay, well, it's true, but murder and violent crime went up in Chicago and Washington, D.C. after we had bans. But that's not really a fair comparison, they'll say, because people could go and get guns from, rest of Illinois or Indiana or Maryland or Virginia. The thing is, that doesn't explain why it went up.
Right.
People could buy guns from those places beforehand. It may explain why it didn't go down as they were predicting. Though, if they really believe that caused it to go up, it'd be kind of nice if they had shared that secret with people before the bans were passed.
Right.
But even if you look at island nations that can't go and blame a neighbor, you see every single time that you've had a ban, murder rates have gone up often, 5, 6, 7-fold after bans have been in place. And Turns
And this,
out that
this is
there's a
murder as
simple,
opposed to homicide. I want to make sure we're getting our
right, both, well, I mean, both murder and homicide, depending upon how the place measures it.
right.
Not everybody measures murder, but you see an increase in both of those. And for most countries, murder and homicide are much more close to each other than is true in the United States.
Right.
But you know, you'd think it would cause gun control advocates some pause. Usually the response you'll get back is, "Well, we're not talking about banning guns," but the one is I don't believe that. I think they
Right.
would like to ban guns if they could. But two, um, the point stands for other laws. You have to ask yourself who's most likely to obey the different gun control laws that you have. The reason why murder rates go up after bans is that it's the most law-abiding good citizens who turn in their guns, not the criminals so much. And to the extent that you disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, you actually make it easier for them to go and commit crimes. And that's true for gun control generally. So
Sure.
I'm
Not to
near
mention the moral reprehensibility of forbidding someone their God-given right to protect themselves. It to me is immoral to say, well, this woman doesn't have a right to defend herself because David Hogg was on CNN once. But one thing I would like to kind of hone in on here, we just talked about different countries, but something they bring up, I know they bring up quite a bit, and Vox has done this. I'd like to ask you, do states, so now for stateside where we have obviously a consistent measurement, homicides, murders, do states overall, you just listed Chicago, but states with stricter gun control laws, can they argue that states with stricter gun control laws have lower gun crime? Lower overall crime?
No, the opposite's clearly true. What you have to do is essentially deal with the same point that we dealt with when we're talking about the UK.
Mm-hmm.
You have to deal with what were the different crime rates across these places or murder rates before they had these gun laws and to see how they change after they've adopted them. So you want to kind of pull out kind of the pre-existing average differences across places. And as soon as you do that, you see, in fact, that the places with the stricter gun control laws have much higher murder rates that are there, much higher homicide rates, much higher overall gun deaths. Even if you include suicides in there.
Well, what would we use as examples as far as states or cities with those kinds of laws and high violent crime rates?
Well, the point is how it changes kind of before and after. If they go to the post that we put up on responding to the Vox thing, because you're right, that's one of the things that they put up there. We have a diagram that basically uses something from the Brady campaign, which is a gun control group. Every year since 2001, they put out an index of gun control laws in different places, in different states.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see very clearly that as states have had their number of gun control laws increase, you'll see an increase in homicides or firearm homicides or murders, however you want to break it down.
The loosest gun laws in the country, a lot of people don't know, is Vermont. Vermont is the one place in the country, I think maybe Arizona now, but you can purchase a firearm from Vermont. Then you can carry it open or concealed,
Trying
no
really
permit.
hard to reverse all that right now.
I know they are now, but that's for optics.
Yeah.
Right. Up until literally just the last, I guess now, Vermont has had no other state gun control laws on its own. The only gun control laws there are the federal laws that are there. But you have 14 states now that have similar types of concealed carry laws to Vermont, where you don't need to have a permit to carry within those states. There are 12 states which are exactly like Vermont, where you don't need to have a permit to carry any place in the state. And then there are two other states, Montana and Arkansas, where you don't need to have a permit in the vast majority of the state, but in some places you do. And, most of these states' laws are fairly recent, but just like with concealed carry to begin with, there hasn't been the types of bad things that people have been claiming. And, the big benefit of this is who benefits the most from carrying. And my research indicates it's basically the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime. And that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. So you have a state like Illinois, they allow concealed carry now. Mm-hmm. But it costs about $450 to go through the process to go and get a concealed carry permit. Well, who do you think you're stopping from getting a concealed carry permit when it costs $450? And it's just not the cost. It's illegal to go and carry even a permanent concealed handgun on public transportation. There are no training places in the city of Chicago. So if you're a poor person and you have to get 16 hours of training, it's kind of like they checked off every box. Is it expensive? Yes. Do we make it so that you can't take public transportation to go there? Yes. Are there no training facilities anywhere near, remotely close to where you live that we allow? Yes. It's saying, what can we do here to make it so that the very people, poor blacks, who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, can't qualify to go and legally carry a concealed handgun? Um, you have these so-called constitutional states. Those places, these people are going to be able to carry. And you look at a state like Pennsylvania, for example, it's $20 to go and get a concealed carry permit. You see a very big, different mix of people who go and get a permit. In Illinois, so you get a lot of wealthy whites who live in the suburbs to be able to go and carry. Well, that's nice, but they're not the ones who are most likely to be threatened with violent crime. And so you don't see as big of a drop in terms of violent crime from people carrying for two reasons. One, not as many people carry when it's very expensive to get a permit. But two, you're not having the right people carry.
Right. Well, that's an interesting point. Were you going to say something there, Jim?
Oh, no, I think Pennsylvania actually has the largest number of concealed carry holders, I think, in the states. I'm not sure if that's per capita or if that's for overall.
Florida has the most, but Pennsylvania is second.
Second, okay.
Okay.
So Pennsylvania, I think right now has about 1.4 million concealed carry permit holders. Nationwide, you have about 17 million concealed carry permit holders.
Yes.
And
I wanted to touch on that really quickly, if I may interject, because right now we see obviously the children out there speaking about this, and we're kind of tied. These social justice movements are tied together, and of course, gun culture, gun owners, they've brought out these stats. They said this is basically a white man culture here in the United States, the gun culture. But really, that's sort of self-perpetuated by the left, as you're talking about, because of these roadblocks, and that's something I've always found interesting. That's never really brought up. Well, it's because a lot of these suburban white men can afford it, and they don't live in inner city Chicago. They don't live in these areas.
No, it's an important point. Look, you look nationwide, you get about 11%, a little bit over 11%, 12% of concealed carry permit holders are black for the states that we have that data. You look at someplace like Los Angeles, where I was able to get the actual list of permit holders there. They have fewer than 300 permits for a county of 8 million people.
Right.
But blacks only have about 6% of the permit holders that are there. Nationwide, women make up about 32% of permit holders, but in Los Angeles, they make up only about 7% of permit holders.
Is that because of the kind of old boys network? You have to. I mean, my brother lives there. You have to get a sheriff's permission. It's a lengthy process.
So here in 8 of these states, you have to go and get some public official, either a politician, a judge, a sheriff, a police department, to go and let you decide if you can carry a permit. And the thing is, these are overwhelmingly Democratic areas, and yet the Republican areas have high rates of blacks being able to carry and women, but the places where you have to get permission from a Democrat to be able to go and carry, they basically give it to white males. They don't give it to, you have to go and give them a good reason to be able to go and carry. And living in a dangerous area isn't considered to be a good reason.
Yeah.
And
living in Watts, living in Inglewood, that should be reason, case closed.
I think in LA, you have to prove that you are carrying so much money sometimes too.
Yes,
like
that's a big part of one of the barriers to
something.
entry. I think it's if you're carrying something like
that would eliminate a lot of probably women and black families.
Is it the number? Is it something like $10,000, Mr. Lott? You need to prove that you are either carrying that amount or that amount of equipment.
Or worth that much.
It's subjective. Oh. There's no hard and fast rule that's there, and I guess that's part of the problem. In New York City, also, you have a similar thing. You have to go and get permission from the New York City Police Department to be able to go and get a permit. So you have to go and give them a good reason. And you look at the list of people. There's like the publisher for the New York Times. There's some famous radio show hosts. You have heads of labor unions
Right.
have concealed carry permits. Well, it's nice. I'm glad those people are able to go and protect themselves. They feel that the need to be able to go and do it. But it's a little bit ironic that somebody like the publisher for the New York Times understands the desire for himself to be able to go and protect himself, but some poor person who lives in Harlem, there's like zero chance that they're going to be allowed to get a concealed carry permit. You look at they have it by zip code for the permits that they've given out there. And it's people on the Upper West Side, the very wealthy, swank areas where you see all the concealed carry permits given out. Not the people who actually are in the highest risks of being killed.
Right. Yeah. Well, a good example is Illinois, where we just did a show. We went on campus. We had to cancel the show in the theater because the campus police wouldn't show up even if we paid them. They said, nah, no one's going to, there's no credible threat. I'm like, well, I mean, we actually, we have plenty of credible threats, and we've had we don't have any copycats out there, but I think it's pretty well known I'm on the ISIS kill list. Like, that's kind of a threat. Let's start with that. So they wouldn't show up even if we paid them. And then we had some off-duty officers who had a security firm who we paid out of our pocket to show up so we could do a smaller show. And the campus police were to say they're not allowed to carry. So we actually had to call over their head with a state official who said, of course you can carry as an off-duty officer. So they really do try and set themselves up as a barrier to entry. And that was a great example where we felt totally helpless. We were going, hold on a second. The armed police on campus won't show up.
We can't carry.
For 1,200 people.
Yeah.
We're going, they won't show up. We can't pay them to show up. And now they're trying to say that we can't hire our own security firms to bring their firearms, even if they're off-duty officers. It was just an absolute debacle. And I can imagine how terrible that must feel if you're some inner-city kid from Harlem trying to protect yourself or your family.
Right. Look, I mean, it's interesting you bring up guns in schools. I'm just incredibly frustrated by the debate that we're having right now on gun control. We've had these horrible tragedies. For 20 years, have been yelling, we need to do something about it. But the gun control advocates, the types of proposals they put forward would have nothing to do with stopping these attacks. If anything, they might make things worse. So you have things like background checks on private transfers of guns. It's within an hour and a half of the shooting in Florida at the high school, you had this Senator Bill Nelson there calling for background checks on private transfers. After each of the mass public shootings during the Obama presidency that Obama talked about, that was the one law that he pushed for.
Right.
I would love somebody to tell me one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped as a result of having such a law, because it doesn't exist.
Right.
And yet that's the first thing out of the box that they have. We want to go and increase the age for people owning guns to 21. Well, obviously there was a horrible thing where a 19-year-old killed many people, but there are costs and benefits of any of these changes. What about a 20-year-old woman who's being stalked? What is she supposed to do? Having a gun is by far the safest course of action for her to take when she's in that type of position. And you want to try to measure what the net effect of these types of things are, and there's no discussion. What we do know matters, is that all the mass public shootings in Florida, every single one, and 98% of the mass public shootings since 1950 in the United States have something in common. That is, they keep on occurring in places where general citizens are banned from having guns for protection.
Right.
These killers may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. They know that they can go and kill more people if there's nobody there to go and protect themselves. Anybody who's read any of my work knows that I think police are extremely important in stopping crime. I think that they're the single most important factor.
Right.
But having one police officer in uniform guarding a school or someplace else is an impossible task. Having somebody in uniform is like having somebody with a neon sign above them that says, go and shoot me first. If you're a killer going to go and do an attack, if you can kill that officer, you have free reign for going and killing people, because he's going to be the only one that's going to have a gun to go and stop you. The benefit from having concealed carry for teachers or staff that's there is that it takes away the strategic advantage that these killers have, because they don't know who it is that they have to go and take out first. And the other frustrating thing about this debate is that so much of the gun control debate is about things that might possibly go wrong. So when Senator Rubio had that town hall on CNN, I'm basically, because of my work, I'm forced to watch these things.
Yeah, exactly.
He,
Where the
he,
kids just chastised all of them, him and Dana Lash, and said, "Will you promise to ban all semi-automatic weapons? If not, we have nothing to." It's like, well, hold on a second. You can't just tell him what he has to say. Let the guy talk. It was embarrassing. Yeah.
Right. Well, he was asked about letting staff or teachers be able to go and carry, and his response, absolutely no way. He had talked to some relatives of his who were teachers, and they were worried that if you let a teacher carry a gun and they stopped a mass public shooting, that as soon as the police arrived, the police would end up shooting the teacher. Well, the problem is we don't need to guess about these types of things.
Right.
If people go to our website at crimeresearch.org, we have dozens of cases in the last few years where either police, sheriffs, or prosecutors have pointed to cases where a permit holder has stopped a mass public shooting where multiple people would have died.
Sure.
And you can look at these cases in recent years and you don't find one single case where that type of concern has occurred. There's not one case when the police have arrived that they've shot the permit holder. Another big concern that you hear about is, well, maybe the permit holder will accidentally shoot a bystander when they're trying to stop the killer there. There's not one of those cases. Are these things possible? Sure, they're possible. But at least it would be something more for us to focus on if you could actually point to examples where something like that has occurred rather than bringing up possibility. I'll give you one other example of this. After 9/11, I was asked by several of the airline pilots unions to help them be able to go and carry guns with them on planes to protect in case terrorist attacks. And I didn't know some of these details before I started helping them, but you'd go into like a senator's office and the senator would go and raise concerns about, well, what happens if both the pilots have guns and they get into an argument and they shoot each other and you have a locked door and you have two dead pilots? Well, what are you going to do then? And the thing is,
a double homicide at the same time, like it's like Rocky III, where they're going there and they right at the bell knock each other out. Yeah, I know. It's these what ifs. They get into the realm of the absurd.
Well, but the thing is, what most people don't know is from 1923 until 1963, all commercial airline pilots in the United States were mandated to carry a loaded handgun with them at all times. It's a type of rule that went into effect back in the early 20s because the U.S. Postal Service started hiring planes to carry the mail. And, you have a biplane crash in a cornfield someplace. They wanted to make sure that the pilot could go and guard the mail and keep it from being stolen. And they didn't know, you wouldn't know until maybe the last moment whether the plane would be carrying mail, so they mandated it.
Right.
Well, 40 years later, they still had the same rule in effect. And but the thing is, and then until 1979, they were allowed to carry a gun if they wanted to.
Any double shot kills, two dead pilots in cockpits? Any?
No.
No? Not even one?
In fact, you can't find, with hundreds of millions of flights, you can't find one single case where a pilot committed a crime with his handgun there. You can find a few dozen cases where the pilots actually used their guns to stop crimes from occurring, but
and if that was in the 30s or 40s, those pilots were drunk. No, I think it is remarkable, isn't it? Funny that we talked about Australia and the UK, where they take these very, very weak correlations to attribute causation. But when you say, hold on a second, in the United States, 98% of all mass shootings occurring in gun-free zones, and you can't point to any crimes that you're talking about in the hypothetical, and they go, well, causation isn't a correlation. I'm a little murky on it. By the way, Rocky II, I misquoted. I know I was going to be fact-checked on that. I had to correct myself. It was Rocky II where I heard.
Well, yeah, I don't know. It's
no examples of these at all in the hypothetical. Even if you get into those examples, right? What if they killed a bystander? Well, hold on a second. 16 were killed anyway at this point. Even if we were to get into the hypotheticals and say, let's engage on this, it still wouldn't be a worse scenario than there are right now. One thing that I've talked about, and I know you've written a lot of research like you've talked about on campus, I think our president overstepped saying that teachers should have to carry firearms, or anyone proposing that. But I certainly think that concealed carry holders who happen to be teachers should be allowed to carry. If they can carry at the supermarket, if they can carry in their everyday life, I think they should be allowed to carry as teachers. I think that's a micro step in the right direction.
Yeah, look, now that to varying degrees have teachers and staff carry. In Texas, you were mentioning Texas earlier. As of last fall, they had 172 school districts in Texas where staff and teachers carry. In Ohio, you have over 100 school districts. In Utah, it looks like about 5% of the teachers actively carry, and about 10 to 12% of the support staff carry. You look across these 18 states, if one of these teachers had a situation where they lost control of a gun and somebody had gotten a hold of it, it would get massive national news coverage.
Right.
If you had accidental gun deaths that had occurred, you'd get massive national news coverage that are there. For K through 12, there's one case in Utah where a teacher a few years ago accidentally, after school hours, fired her permitted concealed handgun and killed the toilet. She accidentally shot a toilet in the bathroom.
It sounds like that was an embarrassing toilet situation before she shot it. That was her ticket out. She's like, think fast. Say, I'll just shoot it. That's less embarrassing than what occurred in here.
Right.
Negligent discharge.
Yeah, who knows? But, and that's if there are a couple other cases, but those are when they have like firearms training classes outside of school hours on school property. If you have firearms training classes and people are handling the gun, that's a completely different type of situation than when you're talking about, actual kind of normal school situations that are going on. And, it seems like we should be able to have an easy debate on this type of thing, but it's something that's really not even considered in terms of looking at the experience that these other places have had. I'd love to live in a world where there's not violence, but given that we do, what are we going to do to try to stop this? And, and it's just not, you have statements from these killers about why they picked the targets that they did. They understand themselves. People may have heard about the Aurora Batman movie theater shooter and the statements he left, or the Charleston church shooter, about why they picked the targets. They had other targets, but they were worried about security or other people having guns at those places. You have a case that probably people haven't heard about. About a year and a half or so ago, there was a case in Detroit where a father was concerned about his son's involvement with ISIS, had gone and contacted the FBI. The FBI recorded his telephone conversations, and they have an amazingly chilling conversation where this person is explaining to a compatriot why he had picked one of the largest churches in the Detroit area to attack, that he had checked and this church had banned anybody from having permitted concealed handguns on church property. And he explained to his compatriot that made it easier for him to kill lots of people before anybody could arrive. And you look at the statistical evidence on this stuff. Right to carry states like Texas or Florida or Pennsylvania or whatever, you're able to go and carry your permitted concealed handgun in 97, 98, 99% of the state. And yet these attacks, to the extent that they keep on occurring in those tiny areas within the state where people aren't allowed to have guns.
Right.
The Batman movie theater shooter, you had 7 movie theaters showing the premiere of the Batman movie within a 20-minute drive of the killer's apartment. Only one of those movie theaters posted signs banning permitted concealed handguns. He didn't go to the one that was closest to his home. He didn't go to the one that had the largest auditoriums in the state. He went to the one that posted signs banning people from having guns for protection.
Right.
The Lafayette movie theater, the same thing. You look at the mall attacks. Omaha, Nebraska, you have like 8 enclosed malls. Only one posted signs. It was the one that was farthest from the killer's home. That's the one he goes to. Similar story with the Kansas City mall shooting. with the Salt Lake City mall shooting, the Portland, Oregon mall shooting.
It's almost
At
reflective of
some
that
point,
98% gun-free statistic, as though they go out of their way to find
They're
them.
mentally ill, but not that mentally ill, apparently.
Right, exactly. They're mentally ill, but acute.
Yes.
Because they have good transportation, I guess. They're probably not taking public transit because you can't carry on public transit. Well, this is very interesting. I know obviously the book is The War on Guns. We have to get going, but crimeresearch.org is where people can go. Let me ask you this final question before we go. I've always said this with the gun control debate right now in this country, particularly if you look at the recent assault weapons ban proposal, particularly if you look at the dissenting opinions with Heller versus D.C. arguing private citizens have no right to carry firearms whatsoever. We never hear about
no
these
right
things.
to self-defense.
Exactly.
In those decisions.
It's insane. It really is scary that we're one vote away from that. But I've always said there's the battle of the informed and people who know nothing about firearms. That's kind of this discussion. Now, there are other political gray areas. Firearm ownership is not one of them. Why do you think, then, the media, New York Times, why are they so hell-bent on pushing gun control? Why do you think that is? Closing thought.
I think people, including people in the media, get impacted by the media coverage over time. If you I know my views have changed a lot over the years that I've been doing this research. I was probably as affected by the media coverage as much as anybody else. If you constantly hear about bad things that happen with guns and never hear about the benefits, or rarely do, who can you blame for having much more negative views? As I say, in recent years, I have dozens of cases where mass public shootings have been stopped by concealed carry permit holders. These cases just don't get national news coverage. Some of them are dramatic cases. A couple, there's film of the person doing the heroic action. When I've gone to news bureaus saying, for sure, they'll cover it with the film here, I've been told, well, it would just be political for us to go and run a story on this. It just...
let's trot out the kids from Florida. A chilling example. We did this on a Dallas campus where we asked people. This was right after Parkland, Florida. They talked about that shooting. We asked these same students. They were about 3 hours away from the Sutherland Springs shooting. We had Stephen Williford on this show before any other news show, because no one else was probably going to give him a fair shake. This guy stopped them. He was an NRA certified instructor, for people who don't know, stopped the bad guy with an AR-15 who shot up a church. More deadly than Parkland, Florida. We asked the students, was this at UT Dallas, or where was it?
Yeah, UT Dallas.
I think it was UT Dallas. I might be mistaken. I don't know if it was SMU, TCU, or
it was UT
Dallas. They all knew about Parkland. I asked them if they'd heard of the Sutherland Springs shooting. Not a single student even knew about it. And no one
about how it ended.
Stephen Williford.
Yeah, look, I can give you tons of examples. You have the Pulse nightclub shooting that occurred in Florida. Florida is one of only 10 states that ban permanent concealed handguns in nightclubs. 10 days after the Pulse shooting, where 49 people were killed, there was an attack that occurred at a nightclub in South Carolina. The difference is that South Carolina allows people to carry permanent concealed handguns in nightclubs. The shooter had wounded 3 people. Apparently, he had like 100 rounds of ammunition on him, and he was continuing to fire. And at that point, a concealed carry permit holder pulled out his gun and seriously wounded the attacker. There's like no national news coverage. I thought for sure, given the sensitivity we just had about a mass public shooting at a nightclub just 10 days earlier in Florida, this would get some national news coverage. You can get quotes from there for the local sheriff saying that he's convinced that if the permit holder wasn't there, there would have been a lot of fatalities that would have occurred. Yep. And then it would have gotten national news coverage. So there's 2 things. One is the fact that the media just doesn't have any symmetry in terms of how it covers these things. But 2, also the facts that they cover. So my guess is the entire gun debate right now would be dramatically different if even once in a while the media would say things like, well, we had another mass public shooting at a place where people were banned from having guns. People would begin to say, geez, that seems to be something that happens a lot with this. And I think it would make a real difference in the debate. But it's often the easiest fact for them to check. They will report other things like the type of gun that was used or how the person obtained the gun. And they'll frequently get those initial reports wrong.
Yeah.
Those are much more difficult things to find out quickly. Even if even if you don't look up the law, if you just have a pair of binoculars, you can see whether the movie theater has a posted sign out front or not there, even if they can't get close to the movie theater.
Even just the recent YouTube shooting. It's one of those things. I find it, HuffPost said, this is the face of domestic terrorism when there was Dylan Roof. YouTube shooting, they have a picture of the police officer, and it says, suspect being held, no motive yet. Well, hold on, we don't need the motive. Show the picture of the suspect. Of course, it was an Iranian PETA vegan activist. And pretty sure Google, YouTube, gun-free zone. Yeah, certainly in that area.
Can't say that because Don Lemon has an opinion.
Exactly, because Don Lemon sitting there, he's influenced by the media. He's going, well, this statistic comes from
Ghost of Dead Johnny
Don Lemon. Wow.
San Francisco County. I'm not sure if this was in San Francisco County or the county right below it, but San Francisco County for many years would have one concealed carry permit holder or two, but the one that had it was the sheriff's personal lawyer.
Right.
He was the one person in the county who was allowed to go and carry a permanent concealed handgun.
Yeah.
It's not like they'd be going to a target where people were going to be able to go and protect themselves. It
is a sad state of affairs. That is, again, John Lott. You can follow him on the Twitter at John R. Lott Jr. The book is The War on Guns. Highly recommend it. crimeresearch.org. Mr. Lott, thank you for taking the time, sir. I really appreciate it. And hopefully some people have learned something new today. Thank you again.
Well, thank you.
Hey, did you like this video? Of course you did. Let's there's something wrong with you, in which case you can comment below. What's your problem with this video? We want to hear from you, and we promise you 100%, I give you, my word is my bond, we'll answer every single negative comment. For those who are normal, you can leave a thumbs up and subscribe.